And this pain of our grief, it really can lead to our personal growth. And that's not to say that, and I think this all the time, if I could take away all these lessons and have my daughter here with me, I would do that in a heartbeat. But I can't.
Hey, I'm Tanya Wilkinson, and this is Death on the Daily, bringing the conversation about death out of the shadows and into the mainstream. Because along with birth and change, if there's one thing that's going to happen to us all, then death is it. And we're going to explore how death actually shows up for us on the daily in a multitude of ways, and how when we allow ourselves to accept and to be with death, how it can teach us a whole heap about how to live this life well.
So welcome to my solo Note to Self episode of Death on the Daily. These episodes are all about integrations from my conversations with my guests. And today I've been reflecting after I had the most beautiful discussion with Alistair Gray. And I'm going to get straight into it because the theme of today's episode is all about love. And this is something that Alistair teaches on the daily. And I wanted to share a quote from Alistair from our conversation, which I found really, really beautiful. He said that death and love are two sides of the same coin. They're synonymous. And the beautiful thing for me about death is that it holds the power to awaken us to a deeper truth. Now, in my experience of death and grief, this I know to be true. There's something so profound of being with my grief and having it really, really shine a spotlight on what's most important in this life. And in truth, when I really go down to the core of what that is, it really is more love. How can I open my heart for an abundance of love in this lifetime? And with that includes obviously loving with the acceptance that those who I love at some point, we will have to part ways. Everything in this life is impermanent. And I wanted to share a quote from Francis Weller that really connects into this. So Francis says that my grief says that I dared to love, that I allowed another to enter the very core of my being and find a home in my heart. And this really speaks to that theme of when we love, at some point, there's going to be a letting go. And to root us in, I thought I'd just share a little bit about how I see the grief that I hold for my daughter. So if you haven't heard the story of myself, my partner, and our daughter, Ngako Rayona, then go back and check out episode 1 of this podcast. Because in that episode, I speak to our daughter who we lost 5 months into pregnancy. We unfortunately had to go through what's called a termination for medical reason because she had a birth defect that wasn't compatible with life earthside. Many of you might be listening to this thinking, oh my goodness, that is the unthinkable, that how could you get through that? And actually, what I wanted to share today was one of the anchors that really helped me to navigate through, and continue to navigate through this process of grief. And this is when I felt my grief in my body, I actually felt exactly where it sat within me. And now for Ngako Rayona, I feel it. It's right here where my heart is. And I call this my little tattoo of grief. And I call it my tattoo because much like a tattoo, it's permanent, it's lifelong. And it's always humming within me, or her name means lioness heart. It's also roaring within me at certain times. And I really see this as a beacon of my love. My grief is a beacon of love. And actually, in coming to realize this and reading incredible books like The Wild Edge of Sorrow by Francis Weller, I've really come to integrate that actually love, and one of the conditions of love is that there will be loss. For all of us, everything in this life is impermanent. And coming to that acceptance of that little tattoo of grief and that it's going to be humming within me. And actually, that is a signifier of the love that I held and I still held and I will hold for the rest of my life for her. I've actually come to quite a beautiful place of acceptance of that and integration of that grief within me. And Lois Tonkin created a model of grief. And this shows that counter to, the assumption of many that grief shrinks over time. It gets smaller and smaller and smaller, and then someday it just disappears. In fact, the grief actually stays there and it's present within us at that same size. But what happens is that we and our life grows around it. So this is where we can accept grief as a part of us, but we know that life and that capacity for that which we can hold, it continues to expand through our life with all of our experiences. And actually, in being able to really root into love, the love that grief is a beacon of, and finding acceptance through there has really helped me to stop myself from running from it, from numbing myself out to it. I know that this grief, I can more than bear as a human. I know it because I'm living it. And by naming it as a beacon of love, that tattoo of grief, that little lioness purr that's within me, when I feel that grief and I feel that pain, it actually serves as a reminder for me of that love that I hold for her and that love that she held for me. So, taking this quite practical, I would say that if you can connect into grief as that beacon of love, and actually, if you're a visual person like I am, connect into it in any way that feels right. Our daughter is a little tattoo of grief. I also feel my granddad, and actually, that's like a little hexagon light of grief that I feel in the top of my chest. Connect into it, visualize that grief. However is coming through for you. You might like to. I've done drawings of it. I've drawn that little lioness heart tattoo. I've also debated about whether I would get that lioness heart tattoo, but I don't think those needles are for me. Too much of a wisp. But I think really, really connect into that grief and that love and how they are interconnected together in any way that brings you comfort. And for some, it might be visual. And gently touching your grief, giving yourself that grace as you do. It's okay if you have to disconnect back out and go back in again. But just gently allowing yourself to be with your grief, to feel that pain, but also alongside that, to feel that love that is radiating out from that very, very tender place within you. And secondly, to support this, I wanted to really root into the fact that actually grief really is meaning making. In connecting into our grief, we connect into that well of memories and of that love for that person. We keep that memory alive. And I think actually, if you're listening to this podcast and you haven't been through a recent loss, but perhaps you have friends and family who have, this is where we can really all jump in to support those who we love and those in our orbit who are navigating grief. Because actually, our loved ones' names, when they're not spoken to, when people aren't given that space where they can be held as they speak to those memories, actually, we're really doing ourselves a disservice to others and to their grief and to them healing through their grief. So, in honoring our loved ones through grief, we can really, really root into that meaning that this grief holds, that love that this grief holds. So, ways that you can do this on an individual level. Obviously, I've just shared, if you know someone who's been through a bereavement, make sure that you're there, make sure that you're listening, make sure you allow them to keep those memories alive as they wish, not just in the, time period between the death and the funeral, and then, maybe a little bit on the other side. Remember that grief, as Lois Tonkin shared, it's with us for life. So remember that 5, 10, 20 plus years up the path, there's also still an opportunity to speak to that. And then for us, I think it really is for me around rituals and meaning. And that's where I've really rooted into in my journey since losing our daughter in particular. For example, I write her letters all the time. I shared this on my social medias recently and I had a lot of love for it. I use yellow heart emojis because she's lioness heart. So obviously yellow heart. That for me is a symbol of the lioness heart that I absolutely adore. So I literally pepper yellow heart emojis all over any message that I can. But every time that I do, some part of me, sometimes really consciously, but otherwise I feel it in my, you know, just subtle energy shifts. Part of me connects into her. That's my little memoriam in every single day. I also wear a necklace. You might not be able to see it if you're watching this, but this is of a lioness and her cub. So I wear this necklace, and it really roots me into that memory and that love that I hold for her. And every time I connect in, I always just let that love in. As well as looking up at the stars, there's one star in the sky that after she died, I really connected into, and that for me, and I speak to that star. That for me is her up in the sky. And finally, before I go into what I call my notes to self, I thought I'd share a little bit around the gifts of growth that can really come through grief and allowing yourself to really feel that love. I see that beacon of love, of grief, for me personally, as my daughter's legacy on this planet. That's her purring through me every single day. I have a consciousness to her, and that grief expresses my love for her and her love for me out into the world every day. But actually, when we root our grief into our forwards path and the growth that we can find happens through our grief, we find that when we allow ourselves to really feel and express our grief, and in doing so, to feel and express our love for that person or that pet that has departed this earth, it actually expands our capacity for empathy and compassion. And for me, I see this as a really beautiful and direct ripple effect and legacy of those who I love. My daughter, that little tattoo of grief humming within me, that ignites a roar of love within me that literally ripples out into every day. And I can feel it. I can feel it in how I interact to others, how I can now hold space for others who are going through difficult times with a greater depth of compassion and tenderness and care. And I love this quote from Rumi. It's grief can be the garden of compassion. If you keep your heart open through everything, your pain can become your greatest ally in your life's search for love and wisdom. So I suppose just rooting into the practical here, it really just is, can you bring awareness to that love that flows through the grief? And how can that connect you deeper into your essence as a human? And in doing so, how can you allow that love to overflow out into the world, into how you move through that world with compassion, care, and connection? And equally, for us as we're supporting others who are going through their grief, similarly, how can we allow our love to overflow to them, to really, really support them and to bring our greatest compassionate presence as we hold space for them? And the other side of legacy that I wanted to just touch on is the fact that grief really does remind us of the impermanence of literally everything in this life. But what that legacy, I believe, of those who have passed can really bring us is rooting us into that which is most important to us in this life. And this pain of our grief, it really can lead to our personal growth. And that's not to say that, and I think this all the time, if I could take away all these lessons and have my daughter here with me, I would do that in a heartbeat. But I can't. So the pain that I feel that's intertwined with the deepest of love for my daughter, it's really taught me how to love myself deeper, how to love others deeper, what's most important in this life, how I can make more moments of meaning, to not take things for granted. The lessons are endless, and that really is the lessons and the imprint of the love of my daughter that will be within me for the rest of my life. So now just to complete and finish with my notes to self. So this is a note to self that I've written to myself in my journaling after my conversations with my guests. I go away and I love writing little reminders to myself. Sometimes I need them in the moment, and sometimes they're ones that I can come back to later. I read these out as a you because equally, if any of these words feels like they resonate, feels like it's something that you need right now, or maybe that a friend needs, or that you might need in the future, these notes to self and these episodes are always here for you. You can always come back to them. You can share them with friends who maybe this can bring them a little bit of comfort in those most difficult times as they're roaring in their grief. So I write these as a you so that you can take this forwards. If these words resonate, take these, make them your own, and really, really connect into them as and when you need. When that little tattoo of grief starts humming or roaring, don't numb or run away from it. Go towards it in love to feel it. In doing so, know that you will feel the depth of that love that you hold for your beloved. Allow that love to overflow into you in this life as you walk it without them. And think of them with a smile as their legacy of love flows through you. So that completes this episode of Death on the Daily. And wherever you are in your grief journey, or if you're supporting someone who's also navigating their own, I hope that this episode has just filled your heart up maybe a little bit more. And know that wherever you are at in your journey, I'm sending you lots and lots of love.
All of my gratitude to you for joining me for another Dead Conversation. Death on the Daily is edited by David Strutt. The music is Set Free by Katie Gray. And I am Tanya Wilkinson. And if you enjoyed this episode, I would be over the moon if you can rate, review, and subscribe. It really, really helps me to get the word out there. And if you want to say hi or to hear more about my work as a coach and death doula, including how I support my clients to navigate their death on the daily, then all of the ways that you can connect with me are in the show notes. I'll be back soon with some more Dead Conversations. And in the meantime, take good care of yourself and others.
There's a cold fire, there's a crossfire, and there's something inside, and we'll never make it, and we'll never break it until